The second thing I want to do before jumping into the main topics is to respond to what several of you have asked me to do, which is talk about the monetary system, the Federal Reserve, all of that. That has become, again, a big touchstone of critical thinking and of popular upset with what's going on. So let me start by trying to be a little bit cute with you and a little bit dismissive. The history of capitalism as a system for 300 years, and indeed the history before it, was always, or periodically, shaken when things didn't work out well, and people got angry or upset or frightened about their economic circumstances. It was very tempting to look around and to find the bad guy. You all know that, scapegoating, whatever you want to call it. And, you know, we see it in America today. Suddenly we're supposed to be very angry at immigrants. They're the bad guys, and we do that. Or if it's not them, well, then it's your usual ethnic minority or the wrong gender or whatever's available. You make them the bad folks. It's sad to watch. It's tragic often. But there's another kind of scapegoating that isn't that way. It's a little different. It looks at the economic system and it divides it into another peculiar way. One part it calls the real economy. The real economy. Watch the words. Because if one part of an economy is real, it suggests that there's another part that is unreal. And that's already, you know where this is going. See, here's the real part. People who make things, you know, sweaters, software programs, cars, hamburgers, whatever. They're working and they're making something real. By comparison, what do banks do? Hold your nose. Do they make something? Nah. They move money from one jerk to another. They give you a loan and make you give them back more than they give you, nasty people. They are shufflers of paper. They don't do anything, get it? Real. So we like to think, some of us, and I'm hoping by making fun of it that you don't do this, we think it's noble to do real things and ignoble to do money things. In many societies, people end up hating the merchant because the merchant doesn't do anything either. You go to a store, everything that's in that store that you buy, that merchant didn't make that. In fact, all the merchant did was buy it from somebody who made it and resell it to you, and then you figure out the way the merchant lives is he charges you more than he paid what he got. He's just ripping you off. And so upset communities will seize upon a merchant and rip him to shreds. Furious at what? In a capitalist system, the people who produce things are left at the end of the process with things in which they have no interest. Their whole interest is to convert the things that are produced into money so they can do the whole thing again by buying inputs and hiring workers. They're in the business of turning it. They have to have somebody whose job it is to sell the stuff. Otherwise, they can't stay in business producing the stuff. So if you want a system to work with production in a market economy, you got to have the merchant. He's as real in this process as anybody else. Without the merchant, the producer can't succeed. Without the producer, the merchant can't succeed. The system that puts them together is what's troubling you, but picking on a particular part is not going to solve the problem. Never has. Okay, why am I telling you this? Because if a merchant's a problem, the money dealer, the money lender is an even bigger problem. So unreal what they do. They don't make anything. Yeah, but in a system like ours, particularly like ours, we now depend on these people. And the dependence is very real. Let me explain. The people who produce sweaters or hamburgers or haircuts, they are dependent on your buying that stuff, otherwise they go out of business. You all understand that. You have a job in a company making something because somewhere someone's buying whatever that company is producing, and if they stop buying, you're going to get fired. So your work, your job, your real production is dependent on the buyer somewhere. Now let's suppose, and this has happened in every capitalist system, the buyers, for whatever reason, aren't sufficient. They aren't able to buy enough stuff to keep you in the job. How has the system solved the problem? The answer is credit. It goes to people who don't have enough money to buy stuff and says, I tell you what, let's cut a deal. We will give you the stuff. You don't have to pay now. You can pay tomorrow, next month, next year. We're going to let you. And that saves your job, because if you didn't give them credit, they couldn't have bought that stuff and you would have got fired. So don't think credit is about somebody else. You're part of a system where everything depends on credit. You do know that, right? The local store where you buy a plastic water bottle, the bodega where you pick up the water when you're thirsty, and you use your credit card. That's a credit card. Hint, that's a loan. You're actually borrowing money from the bank. You get the statement at the end of the month in order to pay the $1.50 for that water. Credit. The reason that bodega is in business, the reason they accept a credit card for a $1.50 bottle of water is because they would go out of business if they didn't. Everybody depends on credit. And who handles the credit system? The money people, the banks. Credit cards are issued by banks. Loans are made by banks. Loans keep this system going. So you can use whatever words you want, but the notion that there's something real over there and there's something only phony money over here misunderstands the relationship. Not only is there credit, but once there is credit, everybody adjusts to credit. For example, just to drive it home to you, many of you have, if you're lucky, a pension system that you've contributed to in your lifetime, so that when you reach 65, you will have a decent old age. Okay? Now, that credit, that pension, is building up the money, hopefully, that it can use to give you that money that it's promised you when you're 65. One of the things pension companies do is they take the money withheld from your check, and you know what? They feed it into the credit system. That money that goes into your pension fund is then circulated out, put in a bank, and lent to you so you can buy the water at the bodega. So if you get rid of the credit system, kiss your pension goodbye. This is a system, all of whose parts have adjusted to a credit-driven system. I'm not saying that's a good idea. I just want you to understand that's how this system works. Of course, you wouldn't have had to load the system up with debt if you had paid people properly in the first business, first moment. Then they wouldn't have had to borrow to buy enough. If you organized your economy to produce what people have the money to buy and give them enough money to buy what they need, then you would be able to organize production and consumption, and you wouldn't need a credit system. This is not advanced rocket science. This is real simple. But we didn't go that way. We didn't. Businesses were eager to make more money, so they pushed the credit on you. Some of you know that. You notice how often in the mail comes another offer of a credit card. What's that about? That's about it's good business for a lot of folks, banks and others, to load you up. That's why you have mortgage debt and credit card debt and student debt and car payments. You're loaded up. Loaded up. It's profitable. And so now we have a system like that. And of course, Banks are going to be everywhere. You probably noticed that in New York City, you cannot go three blocks in any direction without two banks, or places where you can stop and pull money out of your account, right? Banks are everywhere because we've become a debt-driven, debt-dependent economic system. Okay, this has been wonderful for banks because they're in the business of moving the money. Every time the money moves from A to B, they get a piece. They make the loans. They determine they're in great shape. And they get so excited, like all capitalists always do, when they discover a way to make a lot of money, that they become crazy. In a few minutes, I'm going to show you how that shapes our stock market. So banks have become crazy. They started that already long ago. They don't know when to stop. Everything is a new opportunity for a loan, a new opportunity for something. It's just wonderful. And inevitably, they go crazy. They make loans to people who can't pay them back. Uh-oh, now they're in trouble because they made that loan, they expected to be paid back. On the basis of that expectation, they did something else. Now that person can't pay, they can't therefore do the other thing they've committed to. They're in deep trouble. And when they're in deep trouble, they take advantage of the fact that they're the money managers and that they can literally create money. You do know, I hope, all of you, that when you go to a bank and you ask for a loan, either as an individual or as a company, what the bank does is it credits your account. It takes a keystroke, so your bank account says now not $482, which is what you thought you had in there, but $4,482 because they just gave you a $4,000 loan. What does the bank have to do that? Nothing. It just does it. And you, meanwhile, now can write checks with the $4,000 because it's in your account, and you have to pay interest to the bank. You have to pay that back with interest, which is why it's an attractive activity for the banks. And if the banks were restrained, careful people, you know the way the propaganda puts them, the banker, well, then they would never have misbehaved in this situation. They would never have given loans to people they knew couldn't pay back. Their cousin, their uncle, the person who owned something they needed, all of those folks. But it turns out, I know this is coming as a shock, that they didn't behave properly. And they didn't behave properly in such a way that we had collapses of the economy as suddenly the bank, where we had all put our money, didn't have any money. Because they had lent all of it out and they kind of didn't have anything, and anything coming in, and they got scared. And then they used to do something in the 19th century, which was really funny. They would close the doors of the bank permanently. And you'd come, you know, that Thursday morning, looking to get out the money you needed to buy birthday presents for your daughter, and the bank would be closed, and you knew it was a mistake, so you knocked on the glass door. And the people inside showed you one of their fingers, and I won't tell you which one, and you realized that you weren't going to get into the bank. And then it dawned on you that you didn't know when you'd get into the bank. And you asked the people, and they told you they didn't know either. And then you realize, uh-oh. By the way, in the 19th century, this happened so often here in the United States, as in other countries, that there was a term developed called bank panic. You notice anything about that phrase? Bank panic. It's an important association. Banks always inspire panics. They happen so often, it was called, they had years attached to them. You do American history, the bank panic of 1857. And then you have another 10 years, and the bank panic of 1873. That's how you do it. You periodize the history of our country by the chaos of the banking industry. It became unwieldy in the United States, as it did in every other country. And so by the end of the 19th century, in this country it took a little longer, 1910, 100 years ago, you finally said that this is impossible, and we do what we always do when the private capitalist sector spins out of control and destroys us. We bring the government in the vain hope that the government will fix this. And so we created the National Bank of the United States. The way there's a Bank of England, a Bank of France, and so on. But we couldn't call it the Bank of the United States because we had had another attempt at that 100 years earlier that hadn't worked out real well, corruption and all that. So we called it, instead of the Bank of the United States, we called it the Federal Reserve System. Same thing, just a different name. It's the Bank of the United States. And its job was to control and limit and monitor the banks so they wouldn't do what banks always do. The banks were horrified at this idea, tried to fight it, couldn't because there was so much anger in the United States about the people who had lost from bank failures that it was an overwhelming political, so they had to accept the Federal Reserve, 1910. But the compromise was the private bankers would have a level of involvement, sitting on the boards, and control of the Federal Reserve that it basically couldn't do very much that they didn't approve. We didn't have the phrase then. Nowadays we have that in politics. It's called regulatory capture. It means when the regulatory agency is captured by the entities it's supposed to regulate. You know, other people have phrases like closing the barn door after the cows got out, or putting the fox in charge of the hen house. It's the same idea. This is the private banks control the Federal Reserve enough to make sure that whatever it does in a way that doesn't undermine their power so that they can continue. That's why we have collapses every few years. And the Federal Reserve comes in and is shocked. Shocked that this would happen. In 2008, they were shocked. Every time it happens, they're shocked. They spend a lot of time. They come up with a new set of regulations, which in a few years will show that they don't work, and a new set of officials will be shocked. If you actually look at the statements they make, it's stunning. It almost appears that people like Bernanke and Janet Yellen may have read the very statements made by their forebears, because what they say is almost the same words. And I don't think they probably did. It's uncanny. But then again, it isn't, because it's the same story. If you control the banks, they work around it. If you come down on them, they develop new entities, shadow banking, dark banking, banking off the books. It never stops. New devices, new mechanisms, new markets, new securities. Those of you who follow what happened in 2008 know it's the same story. Well, why am I telling you all of this? Because you're not going to solve this problem by reproducing the same routine of the last 100 years. Another crisis, another thousands and millions of people hurt, and what are we going to do? Another Frank, Bill, what was the other guy? Dodd. Yes, Frank from Massachusetts and Dodd from Connecticut. Dodd-Frank, another Dodd-Frank bill, another Banking Act of 1933, another Glass-Steagall. And stop. Every one of these things has been evaded, then weakened, and then dumped. All that's different is the pace at which it's done. And given the experience the banking sector has over the last century, I'm sure whatever we do now, they'll be even faster at getting around it, undermining it, and getting rid of it. Don't focus, here's my bottom line, on the Fed. It doesn't really make sense. You're not going to liberate the real economy by dishing the financial sector. They're interdependent on 100 different levels. And I'm afraid, I don't want to upset anybody, but I'm afraid that the notion that you're going to take a large bank and break it up into a little bank is not going to work either. Because we did have the little banks, you see, and in their interaction, they became big banks. So if you make them little again, they'll probably do it again, only quicker, because they know what's at stake. Meanwhile, if you really did dismember the American banking system into little banks, they would have a very hard time dealing with the very large banks in the rest of the world and would quickly use that as an excuse why to be allowed to get together again. We've seen it 100 times, this story. Do we really need to see it again? Or are we finally ready to grow up and say there's a system here that links finance with production, with goods and services, and that's our problem. How this system works, what the incentives are, and how it makes people behave. Changing the rules, given what we've seen, strikes me as mind-bendingly naive. And so much so that since it's not naive people who think it, it isn't naivete. It's because it's scary to talk about changing a system, isn't it? And it's much more manageable to think about this, or to get rid of this person, this politician, this particular rule, that particular institution, this particular sector, just not the system as it works. But it really is the equivalent of, in medical science, thinking that if your leg hurts, we'll just cut it off. This isn't, it makes a certain sense, but it's a very dangerous way of thinking. Okay. Let me turn then to the major topics for today. Many of you have been affected by, or if you haven't been, you're not aware of it, by the craziness of the stock markets since January 1st. Not that they weren't crazy earlier, but they got really crazy so far, including today when the Dow Jones fell 400 points, the NASDAQ dropped 150 points. These are large movements of the stock exchange coming on 10 days of large movements of the stock exchange. So what is going on and what is being said about it and what can I offer to you? Okay, here's the stuff that's coming out of the media, both financial media and general media. First thing, number one culprit, point the finger, China. I have a suggestion for all of you, which you've probably figured out yourself. When you hear a social problem and it's associated with China, change the channel. Because this is going nowhere. This is really nutty. But well, let's pursue it. In the first few days of this year, the Chinese stock market did plummet. It plummeted because there are accumulated problems in China, no question. And there are problems because the Chinese government, trying to control and manage a very fast-growing economic system, is doing a lot of learning by doing and trial and error, and they had imposed a new rule. Nobody quite understood why they did. It's called a circuit breaker. If there's a drop in the value of shares of a certain percentage, the stock market closes to stop the downturn, and they kind of give everybody a breather. So they imposed that as of January, the first day of the trading year, and people around the world said, oh my God, they must be really scared to impose such a thing, so I better get rid of my shares, thereby producing the very downturn that the circuit then broke. And for the next several days, the Chinese stock market looked really bad, losing a lot. So what were the long term, what grain of truth is there in all of this? The grain of truth is the following. China is an economic success story. There really is no way to not say that. Over the last 30 years, they have come further in a shorter amount of time than any other important economy ever has. And given how poor they were, and given that they're the largest country by population in the world, that is a stunning achievement. And whatever else you may say, you really owe it just to your own honesty to understand what a stunning success this economic program of growth is. The costs of it, staggering. But the costs of economic growth in other societies was staggering too. Not the least horror in China is if you go there now, you immediately discover that the level of pollution and environmental damage is mind-bending. They are paying a heavy price in that, with the disease that causes and the health effects and the long-term. I mean, so this is not a justification. I'm just describing to you that they have come very far, very fast. How did they do that? They made a decision, they really did, 35 years ago, that their economic strategy would be to take their enormous population, to take the relatively high level of education they had achieved, particularly for a poor country, the relatively high level of work discipline that was either part of the Chinese culture or also developed in the last period of the government since Mao Zedong takes over at the end of the 1940s. Whatever it was that they had, they decided we can grow best by saying to the world, we will become the most efficient, cheapest source of manufacturing goods on this planet. Partly by what we offer, but partly by a deal we offer to the rest of the capitalist world. Close your factories in Europe, close them in Japan, close them in the United States and Canada, and move them to China. Why? Because you're going to get a worker who's as disciplined or more than you're used to, who is, if not quite as skilled, will quickly become so, and you will pay a wage that's a tiny fraction of what you're paying now. You will be more profitable than you dreamed of. Leave where you are, come here. To make a long story short, that invitation was offered, and that invitation was accepted. And the big manufacturing left the rest of the world and moved to China. Am I exaggerating? A little, but not a lot. And that worked. Wow, did that work. It enabled them to take 300 to 400 million people from the countryside of China and move them to the urban, industrialized coastal areas, north and south, and create an urban, industrialized working class in one generation. Never been done before. Never been done before. That size, that speed, unbelievable. And they produce everything. That's why all of you are sitting here in Chinese underpants. Okay? My apologies to those of you who have found a way to avoid doing that. Most of us can't do that anymore. That's it. And it's true of the toasters, and it's true of the, you name it, it's either been produced in China and says on it, made in China, or, because it's very important, it's been produced in China and doesn't say it's made in China. That's also important because that helps solve a problem that might otherwise exist. So you're all dependent on it. Western capitalism has become dependent. Not only the profitability of our biggest manufacturers. Half of what comes into the United States from China is produced in subsidiaries of American corporations that moved there, that closed their production here and moved it over there to make more money. No, nothing else, real simple. So the Chinese began to produce everything at a price nobody could compete with. Even a company that wanted to stay in the United States or to stay in Canada or to stay in Germany can't do it for very long because its competitors are going to China and undercut them in every market. They can't. They just can't.
How do they handle the transportation cost? To go from one part of Germany to another is one cost. To go from China
That's
to Germany.
good question. Good question. Excellent question. How do they cover the transportation cost? The answer to that is that you understand how much of a drop in the wage cost was offered by China. It was so big that even when you added the transportation cost of bringing the stuff all the way back from China to Germany or to the United States, they still were ahead because the excess profits from low wages more than offset the extra cost of the transport. And for those of you that are ecologically minded, please understand this. We now get our underpants and everything else, not from somebody 10 miles away or 50 miles away or 100 miles away. We get it from somebody 10,000 miles away, which means a tanker, a ship, has to pollute the water, burn fossil fuel. You want to know what is messing up the planet? It is this absurd, but of course it isn't absurd, is it? And what makes it happen? Is it that people are wasteful, that you ought to recycle? Stop! Stop! This is capitalism. You're living in a pollution created by the fact that profit is what dictates where the production is made. Capitalists use profit, and they said, not in Cincinnati, in Shanghai. And the fact that you have emphysema as a result, that's collateral damage. And I'm sure if you call up the company in question, the operator has been trained to say, we apologize. Yes, of course. So the Chinese, but don't lose the big picture, the Chinese hitched their wagon to Western capitalism, because the only way this is going to work is if the Chinese have a market for all of this stuff they're going to produce. Because remember, the factories still sit in Cincinnati. You go to Cincinnati, you'll see them. The factories that made the shirts and the factories that made the trucks and all the rest of it, they're there, the capacity is there. We just added capacity in China when we moved there, which is one of the reasons we have a problem in the world economy now, because we have what's called excess capacity. The capitalists, in their rush to be in on the cheap production of China, went in and built all the factories that you can see in China, all the cities for the people to live in that work in the factories in China. Everything was geared to selling all that stuff in the West, where the markets are. The Chinese are too poor. You can't build up that Chinese economy selling to the Chinese. They don't have the money. The West has the money for a while. For a while. And not enough money, but that's not a problem, because you now know how that's solved. It's called credit. You can borrow to buy the underpants you couldn't afford otherwise. So you borrow, and the Chinese smile as we go into debt, because it keeps them functioning. But the whole development of the Chinese economy then is dependent on exports, producing things in China that you ship to Europe, North America. Guess what? Over the last 8 years, with the collapse of the 2008 crash, Western countries can't buy anymore the way they did. Wages have gone nowhere. Large numbers of people are unemployed. They're not earning any wages at all. Not only that, they can't get credit anymore because they already have more credit that they can carry. So the Chinese are suddenly confronted with a momentous problem. They have built their entire economic plan on exporting to parts of the world that can't grow anymore the way they did. To which the reaction is, oh, and then there's a word that starts with SH, but I can't say it. We're in trouble. What are we, the Chinese, what are we going to do? Well, we have no solution to this. We look at the Western world and we can see they are not only not able to buy our stuff now, they're not looking like they're going to be able to buy our stuff ever, or at least not for a long time. So we can't look for a recovery. That may be fun PR inside the United States to keep the political life bearable, but we're Chinese, we're hard-nosed, we're trying to figure out what's going on. That delusion we can't allow ourselves. So the Chinese came up with their own plan, the only one really that's there. We have to convert the Chinese economy from an export-focused, export-dependent economy onto an internal demand-driven economy. We have to build up the wages of our masses so they can buy the stuff we can here produce, and we have to cut back on manufacturing because there's no more capacity in the world than we need, and build a service sector economy, what the West has already done, more than they did. And that's a tremendously difficult transition. It's been a terrible transition in every country in the world, including the United States. That transition from manufacture to services, from an export-oriented to a domestic, the Chinese are trying to manage that. And that's a very bumpy, difficult situation. And that's why their stock market gyrates. Because they're trying to make, and no one knows if it'll succeed. Whether they'll be able to build up their internal demand enough to cope with it. You know, how fast is the export market shrinking? How quickly can they bring up their own domestic market? Those are big questions for which no one knows the answer. So the stock market, but this is not a problem of China. That's just, let me be blunt, stupid. This is a problem of a global economic system. The reason the Chinese are having their problem is because we have a problem and they can't sell to us the way they did. And we can't borrow the way we did. That's not their problem, that's our problem. But it's not a question of their or us. This is a crisis not of a country, it's a crisis of a system in which all the countries are entwined. But that's the no-no of our society these days. Can't look at the system. You can't point at capitalism as a way of organizing how countries interact, how finance and production interact. You can't look at that. You got to decide who's the good guy, who's the bad guy, who's the right country, who's the good country, who's the bad. Stop. It really is childish. It's childish, intellectually childish and politically retrograde.